Well, yeah, an interventional radiologist is essentially it could be rebadged as an image-guided surgeon. We use lots of different imaging techniques, which could be, for example, CT scans or ultrasound scans, which many people would have heard of when perhaps they're pregnant. And we use those to guide needles into various parts of the body and then go further with that. So some of the things we do, for example, are treating patients with very enlarged arteries called aneurysms, and we can put devices called stents into them to then gradually reduce the size of that aneurysm. Patients that might be bleeding heavily, we can block the blood flow from where it's coming out, and we can also unblock blood vessels. So I think what the best way to describe us is like plumbers.
I love
Where
that.
we fix your leaking pipes and we unblock your blocks, so it's it's a specialty which is not very well known, but it's been around for 50, 60, 80 years at least. And
Wow.
it's almost like the doctors. We're often seen as the back office guys, but we do serve every specialty in the hospital, and there's rarely a patient that doesn't come through interventional radiology. I mean, I've been sort of involved in this field for 4 or 5 years, more from the deployment side. So my real interest is actually about how we translate tools that have been, gone through an R&D process and have then come to fruition, may have got their regulatory marking, and how you actually then implement that in a real world setting. There's a lot to do with that. But the reason at the moment why radiology is probably the fastest growth area in healthcare for AI, I think that's going to change in the next couple of years. But at the moment, and then over the last few years, that's what's happened. It's because the scans essentially are already digitized. Radiology became digital sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, and then after that, it really took off in the millennia, the turn of the millennia. And that meant that it's easy data, if you like, to then feed through a computer or an algorithm or a machine learning interface to then generate an output. Remember, about 20 years ago, still a lot of hospitals, well, in the UK at least, were still using paper-based notes. Whereas now, pretty much, I would say that every hospital in the country, I think, has at least started, or if not completed, their transition to electronic patient records, which then means the next growth area is going to be in that for AI, especially with the advent of things like large language models. But the other growth area in radiology at the moment, we use what we call narrow AI, so algorithms developed to do a specific task. But with the advent of large language models, like everyone will have heard of ChatGPT, but medical specific large language models, and then now what we call vision language models, actually these narrow AI products might be superseded by these newer models. So we'll see what happens there, but definitely radiology has seen a massive explosion at the moment. I mean, it's a huge industry. I think it's something like $600 million in 2022, and that's probably going to be about 2 or 3 billion by the late
Wow.
part of this decade. So it's a huge growth rate. And remember, radiology, when we talk about radiology, people think about the scans they have when they go for an X-ray or a CT scan, but lots of other specialties like cardiology, neurology, to the brain, they're not radiology, but they use a lot of imaging techniques themselves. So those areas are also, seeing huge growth actually. I think there's definitely a bias in the training data sets, and that's because some diseases, for example, have a predilection for one gender over another. So whether you call that bias or just the way the disease is, it's difficult to know. But as humans, we can, at this point in time, still understand that, and we have our own biases, of course. However, if a disease mainly affects a man, but then a woman comes in with it, you would potentially, as a human, still, depending on the condition, you might be biased to think that it's because it's unlikely to happen in a woman. You might just think it's never going to happen in a woman. So you'll go down an investigative route, looking at all other possibilities before then concluding that it is the condition that happens mainly in men. Now, that in itself is a bias that we have as humans. And if you imagine then that training data set, which is mainly predominantly on men, and the volumes are on men, is what's then training an AI algorithm. So then when a woman comes in with that condition, and we're all used to having an AI algorithm around, and we've become dependent on it, and that's called automation bias in a way, where just like you have your mobile phone or social media, there are lots of skills we've lost with time. So for example, we probably would find it really difficult if we had to, for those who are old as me, pull out the A to Z in the car and start looking at a map. I mean, you know, now we've just got all the different mapping technologies. If they all failed, what would we do? We just automatically assume that the map is giving us the best route. But we know of several instances when we're driving that if you're still not just absolute slave to the mapping technology, you'll take a different route and suddenly the map will say, oh, it's like 3 minutes shorter, even though it's saying to go a different way. So we've become dependent on technology. And that is definitely going to happen in medicine, because medicine, doctors, nurses, and all the allied healthcare professionals are all humans, and humans have the same psychology. When you take mass groups of them, you'll get spectrums of very critical people that can discern and understand what's the underlying biases in a technology, and hopefully they'll become the sort of leaders in their institution to explain that to everyone. But there's a whole lot of education to be done before we become dependent on these models. Of course, the data scientists totally understand this, and there are multiple clever ways, you know, and I'm not a tech guy and a data scientist, but there are multiple ways that bias can be mitigated when they're training the data sets, from adversarial mechanisms to lots of other things. But at the end of the day, you will, as a deliverer of healthcare, still have to have the ultimate responsibility for the time being, you know, on a decision-making process for the patient. And that means whatever tool is at your disposal, whether it's a standard scan or a scan augmented with AI, you need to try and understand and interpret what the results are. So at the moment in radiology, if a doctor that's not a radiologist is requesting a scan on a patient, and we'll give a report on it, it's absolutely the duty of that requester of the scan to understand what the limitations of the scan are, what its benefits are, and then to understand what we put in a report, and then match that and have that understanding and apply it to the patient's situation to see if the findings on the scan actually match up with the patient's clinical position, and then institute a treatment. I'm glad you brought that topic up, because you know, we briefly discussed it earlier. If you take the example of a condition I treat, which is aortic aneurysms, and we put in stent grafts, they're called. Essentially, if you think of a blood vessel which is ballooning, or like a tire with a weak spot in it where it starts to blow out, you know, that can happen in blood vessels, in this major blood vessel in the abdomen, in the tummy. It's mostly men that suffer from that, but women also do to a lesser extent. So across the globe, I'm not talking about AI, but across the globe, screening programs, and particularly in the UK, it's famous for it, have been set up to screen for this condition. And a screening program is set up when it's thought that they're intervening. If you pick up the condition early and it's in enough people, and you can do an intervention and prevent the condition from getting worse or eradicate the condition, then that's when there's a lot more to it, but that's essentially when you can set up a screening program. And since it's like breast cancer, it's mainly in women, of course, but the odd man that gets breast cancer may not get as well treated as a woman that gets breast cancer. It'd have to be a very, on the ball clinician that does that. And there are men that get breast cancer, and the converse is true with women. So in aortic aneurysms, although mostly men get it, screening programs are set up to detect this condition in men over 65, because that's when it's likely to occur. You can also say that what about men under 65? So now we have that, and we treat those men, and we've got the recordings of those treatments and what we've done, and we know what stents we've put in. Now, the stents are designed for aneurysms. The stent manufacturers will have used data which is mainly based on men, because they mainly get the condition. So when I do the treatment, when we get women with the condition, we're using stents that have been built. Yes, they've taken into account women, but it's mainly done from data, the high volume data that is on men. And I do find sometimes that women will have smaller blood vessels than men. So sometimes it can be harder to place some of these devices into a woman, and make the procedure a little more difficult. So in the future, there are already multiple algorithms being developed to analyze the scans themselves before the patient has the treatment. And that's to measure the diameters and the length of these blood vessels so we can plan our operations. If that's mainly on men, with say 10% women, then the next logical step would be to have a machine learning algorithm which can then give you a suggestion of what the best device might be to use in this situation, essentially giving you a nudge or some further information. Whereas at the moment, we might have 2 or 3 different options. It might come out with 5 or 6 different options, knowing the whole of the market, and suggest actually knowing the whole of the market. If the patient's not an absolute emergency, we would recommend this, X, Y, or Z. And that training data, that's definitely going to be coming down the road. Now, you can imagine all that data has been based on men, and it's now going to produce an output, which has been based mainly on men. So when a woman comes in, of course, the algorithm will recognize that the gender, because it's built into the metadata of the scan. However, the output is likely to, because it's been trained mainly on male data, output is likely to be biased, unless you know that that algorithm has been trained on just as many female scans as male scans. And that comes down to then when you select which algorithm you want to purchase in your institution, you're going to have to understand how it was trained and what was the training data set. So you're going to have a training data set, you're going to have a pre-deployment validation data set, and then you're going to have a monitoring data set. So we're going to have to understand all of these as doctors who are basically responsible for the delivery of healthcare. And in the Western world, or in the UK for sure, we're very keen on health and safety and governance in this country, which is right. But we're probably, and what we're doing in my institution is setting up an AI. We have an AI working group. We have an AI steering group. We're now building an AI strategy, which I'm writing for our trust with the help of an excellent team that I have. And we're going to have to start factoring in things like gender bias or racial bias. And that's where we have university input from data scientists from University of Kent that can feed into our strategy documents for when you procure anything. And all this has to be built into the procurement systems and frameworks that are currently existing in the NHS, which are really at the early days, and they haven't really factored in bias at the moment, but that's what's going to have to be done. To 100%.
Yes.
But let me expand on that. That's the ideal scenario, that every model that is built takes into account the minorities that may be part of that doctor's practice, if you like, on which they're delivering healthcare. I would say the great opportunity with AI is actually to reduce existing health inequalities, because I work in Kent, but I live in Southeast London. I live in an area where there are lots of Black people, lots of Asian people, but I work in an area where they're definitely much more than minority. Although since the time I've been living there over the last 15 years, that is changing, both in the staff and in the patients. However, I'm going to take it back a step. When you are training as a doctor, when you are training as a data scientist, you are a human being. You are influenced by your own psychology. And whatever you say, no matter how much you try to be unbiased, you will always have subconscious biases. You need to be aware of that, but most people aren't, unfortunately. So therefore, when building models, there's a whole lot of equality and diversity that you just might not even be aware of, because you're not from that background. So as a Black person data scientist, you might not be aware of issues that European people would have, or white people might have. And as a white person, you may not be aware of issues that Black people, Indian people, Asian people might have. So what you're going to need really is at this stage, at the beginning stage, because what we're talking about is building data sets and algorithms at the beginning, which in 20 years' time, we'll see the repercussions of, because what's a ripple now will be a tsunami 20 years down the road. And so right now, when we build these teams of data scientists, we need to improve, and doctors, and I think it's definitely changing in medicine, to be honest. I am not a data scientist, so I don't see what the diversity is like in the data science institutions, but I think, again, it depends on which country you live in, which part of the UK you live in. London's a total different ball game to other places, So if your team of data scientists and doctors that are developing an algorithm are naturally diverse, then you're probably going to build that diversity into the algorithm, even if the training data set is quite singular, narrow, and biased, because it's only trained on men. If you've got loads of women on the team that are building that algorithm, they might say, hang on, it's mainly done on men. So we need to get more data on women. Theoretically, it's just a natural subconscious bias, and that subconscious bias can only be defeated by having diversity. I think engagement is such a nebulous term that I'm a little bit of a cynic, and it might come through, but engagement can be something from sending out some letters, or a non-specific ad on a billboard or on a radio, get one attempt, and then that's the engagement done, and then box ticked. We done engagement, didn't achieve it, but we did it. And we've got pressure on us to build the algorithm. We've got loads of investors. I'm not saying this is actually what happened, but you could see that the pressure is on to get something developed, because at the end of the day, people want a return on their investment. And that is the way the world works at the moment. But it's all about, actually, I think it's about community leaders really trying to speak up and make the presence known of their communities. Because until that happens, not that it's the only way, but until that happens and the voices are raised, then will only people start to take notice. And that comes down to politics, it comes down to government, and it becomes then a long road. But things like this, you know, raising awareness of the issues is the only way to do it. And again, I say that when you have a diverse team, your engagement will be better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you will fight the corner. The diversity will naturally come out, so that those people in the teams will fight the corner for the engagement, because they've grown up in a certain community and a culture, or are a woman or a man or whatever, you know. So
yeah,
it all comes
I totally agree. And the part that I'm interrupting you to because I'm so passionate about this, so I apologize. It's really, if naturally through the organizational structure there is no diversity at that level, that doesn't mean that there can't be. So it's inviting people to come in, not just for a one-off meeting and then the next time they see the outcome or the decision is at the end, but to keep them as part of the process. And I think it's thinking outside the box. We should be concerned if, when we're making a decision for a diverse community, or if we're making a decision that's going to affect diverse communities, we shouldn't be satisfied that it's the same people who look the same, think the same, act the same, that are actually doing this. And I think that's probably, in my humble opinion, layman's opinion, that's probably what's happening. And that's why we're seeing this gap in the data. And we've got to think about, we've got to put the end user back in the framework. In this case, we've got to put the needs of women back at the center of what we're trying to achieve. So I really like the fact that, you know, you really brought out the point that communities and community leaders need to raise their voice, and we also need to probably be a positive disruption to some of these projects.
Sure. Well, you know, several years ago, just before COVID, really, a couple of years before that, I as an interventional radiologist, I like working just at the cutting edge of medicine. I just enjoy working with technology, and I get almost an instant gratification seeing that, you know, using the latest technology, we can really make an impact on a patient's life, really, and that gives me a personal satisfaction, and it makes me want to keep going, really, despite all the negativity you hear about the NHS, which is pretty hard to work in at the moment. But what I saw was what's happened in our lives outside of medicine, AI creeping in for good at the beginning, or the internet or technology coming into our lives for good. When the internet came back in the 90s, I think, when I sent an email, I remember what a brilliant thing it was. And it still is, but it has morphed into something which has got so much negativity around it. Whilst you can do so much and be so productive, we wouldn't have the life and world we have today, for its good and its bad, without the internet. But there's so much negative influence on it, which seems to get more attention than the good at the moment. And that can be because of amplification factors and social media, etc. But what I saw in medicine back then, before COVID, was if we don't take hold of AI, then it will take hold of us. And we as the deliverers of healthcare need to absolutely guide it and develop it. And that's what's happening now. But, back in those early days, data scientists would come up with brilliant algorithms, but they might fall flat in their face when they're actually tried in real life, because the training, we've learned so much in the last 6 years. I can't tell you how much. It's definitely a different podcast. But that then led me to speak to our radiology director at the time. And I said, we need to do something. We need to get involved in this. We have to work out a way how we're going to harness this technology for the good of patients. And at the time, that director of radiology was a woman, and she's the one that's really thought about it, I think, and then understood where things were going. Well, I've spoken to her a few times, and she said, well, why don't you take the lead on it? And that's how it started. And it's now morphed from something which was, and that was something which it was in a way not resourced in terms of the team I would have around me. It was a one-man job. I had no admin support in it or anything like that. But, I would be chasing people to organize meetings, and normally it's the other way around. But I just did it to get it off the ground. And that, I'm so pleased to say that now it's morphed that we have, a chief clinical, I didn't do these things, but in our hospital, we have a chief clinical information officer, a chief analytical officer. We have an IT governance manager. We now, the trust have made roles and employed people that with me on board as a team member, I think we've got the great structure to really now make it mature and develop a strategy for our region and our trust. And there's other areas that are doing the same. We can all club together, bring our knowledge, and really try and develop a framework for the UK to have what we call benevolent AI. I would say I think there are a lot of benefits, but there is a huge amount of danger, and we have to be very mindful of all of that. And it's taxpayers' money, so it has to be value for money at the end of the day. At the UK level, we need to make sure from the school level that ethnic minorities, women, actually, what I would say this, it just depends where you are in the UK. Where a white person is a minority, they need to be targeted and ensure that they get equivalent treatment to the other peers that are around them, because I don't want to forget that aspect of it. Whoever is a minority, it needs to be ensured that they get equality of opportunity. And that will then lead to better recruitment into the universities for data science, for medicine, and that will then lead to better outcomes for AI. It's a long road, but that's what has to happen. And actually, it's really nothing to do with AI. It's just to do with life. And AI is based on our life, and then later life will be based on AI.
And in that scenario, starting at this kind of school levels and working through, do you have any specifics around women, for example?
Yeah, well, I have two daughters. Okay. I can see the bias in my own family. I can see my nephews who, are on the computer all the time, and they can do things on the computer far ahead of my daughters, because there's probably been some bias in my own family where, not that I've discouraged them from being on the computer, but where I've thought, actually, it seems like you like this, and it seems to be a more female activity. I thought that's what they should do, but it's just the way she's grown up, and then so I've encouraged her to do that. But those are biases you have in your head. So specifically, I think women need in AI, I think women need to definitely be recruited more into the data science areas. And from a young age, I think parents need to work out how they can guide their daughters on computers, on the internet, without the pollution of social media, to be honest, at the moment, that we all know about. So just developing those technical skills and the appetite for it from an early age, rather than thinking, well, you know, the boys on the Xbox and the daughters helping mum cook, you know, because it still happens. That's the way it is. That's the way families run.
And also just on that example, and Neelan, it's there's a cultural nuance there, right? So there are certain cultures that just have certain traditions and customs, and we don't want to break that. We don't want to break that, but we also need to be looking at addressing. So it's typical that some cultures would encourage women to be nurses, but they definitely would probably struggle with a daughter becoming a data scientist. So there are those nuances, and so we don't want to break cultures.
Absolutely not. But we want to celebrate all of that. We need to address it. I think it's just about awareness, actually. It's you know, and I think as each generation spends longer and longer in that, what I call the host country at the beginning, you know, so I'm second generation, you know, my children will be more, will have less of the original biases, if you like, that were from back in India, to, because they're so integrated in the UK. We're English, you know, so it will take time, and we'll get a new type of culture. That's what happens, and that will then come into the data science side. And the big the big tech companies, or all tech companies, they have their policies for that, but they just have to have a mind to make sure that they do recruit a diverse team. And once you start ensuring that you have the diverse team, and you ensure that everyone's paid equally as well, then that will filter down, trickle down to women, to young children, to girls, to say that could be a career for me. I think I touched on that earlier, but for example, there are frameworks now. It's not a regulatory body, but they're in touch with the regulatory bodies. But the regulatory bodies need to understand. They need to come up with guidance where I think that they have to state it should be incumbent upon the frameworks that you. So in the NHS, there are frameworks that you can procure software, hardware, anything off, right? Medical devices, rather than, and it makes it easier for each individual hospital to then get it off a framework, because when you procure something, there's a whole huge amount of legal stuff you have to go through to procure something, to make sure you're doing it fairly in terms of competition law. And when it's on a framework, these framework providers take care of a lot of that due diligence. So it just means it's like going into the supermarket. When you go into the supermarket, what's on the shelf? You think there's a basic level of safety that's been done by the regulator, by the supermarket, to ensure that food's not going to poison you. And that's essentially what the frameworks do. So you can go and pick it off the shelf with still a bit of your own due diligence, you know. Those frameworks with the regulators need to have it written into their DNA that the training data set of that AI software has to demonstrate how it's been diverse enough. It has to be diverse enough, not diverse to the point where you can't start using it, because otherwise we're going to get nowhere. You have to start somewhere. So you have to be pragmatic about it. We have to set a minimum benchmark, and we have to look at different areas, different diseases. I think this is where doctors can come in actually a lot, and other healthcare providers, of course, to say, this is where we think, as a group of experts, there should be a minimum data set for training an algorithm in this particular pathology, as a whole. Radiology at the moment is so narrow, because I could say, if there's a lump on a chest X-ray, i.e. a cancer possibly, it doesn't matter whether they're male or female. You've identified there's a lump. Now go and find out what that lump is. But the incoming AI, using sort of generative AI, is going to be looking at the whole end-to-end pathway. So the patients come in. Why did they come in so late with their pathology? They've been coughing for like a year. Why did they only present now? Is it because they're from a ethnic background where they don't go to doctors much, that kind of thing? And to the end product, like where this patient, they had an X-ray, they had a lesion, then they ended up in intensive care, but these other people didn't end up in intensive care. So we've got all that data to work out. Then you can start predicting who might end up going to intensive care or not, and then you can start allocating resources based on your predictive modeling of how the last 20 years, how it's gone. And with all of that, we can then set the benchmarks of how you do that training over the long term, and then that can feed into the regulators to actually say that's now the minimum that you have to do if you want to bring something to market.
Dr. Neelan, thank you so much. It's been enriching. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we look forward to collaboration in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Appreciate that opportunity.